Shalom, shalom. This is Rabbi Moshe Otero with the Ways of Israel. I want to touch with you today or talk to you about the number 666. No, this is not Sesame Street. This is in all seriousness, because many rabbis think that the idea of 666 is not a Jewish thing. It's not an issue of that's whether it's Judaism. As a matter of fact, anytime you mention 666, or you mention anything about the beast, or you mention any of these things, all of a sudden you'll get the stamp, oh, that's not Jewish, it's Christian. So we're going to take a look at this today, really briefly, because we need to correct misunderstanding. First of all, the concept of 666 is an old thing. It's nothing new. As a matter of fact, it took place during the first century of the Common Era, during a period of time where Rome was persecuting Jews of all sorts, not only Jews who basically didn't believe in any Messiah, but even Jews that did believe in Messiah. And here we have the issue that literally the idea of 666 and the beast, what is considered in Greek because of the Alexandrian Jews utilized it so much. In a book that is considered a Christian book, but nevertheless, it is labeled under Jewish apocalyptic literature. Jewish apocalyptic literature. As a matter of fact, this is one of the books that was going to be left out for those of you who don't know this from the Christian canon because it was so full of Jewish mysticism. Keep in mind, Jewish mysticism was even in tune during the new beginning of the new church, and it invaded many of the concepts that you'll be reading in the book of Revelation or Apocalypse. In chapter 13, verse 18 of the book of Apocalypse or Revelation, and most of the manuscripts, quote unquote, in the New Testament, the number 666 appears there and represents 660 and 6. Literally in the papyrus, one of the more ancient ones that is dated around 200 to 275 of the Common Era, which has been preserved as one of the most oldest manuscripts in the Codex of Ephremi Rescriptus. That number appears also in the Arabic numerals as 616 and not 666. Critical editions of the Greek text, however, makes mention that there was a variance in the actual mention of 666, that some believe it was 616. The number of the beast as described in this book of Apocalypse, chapter 13, verse 15 through 18, is an apocalyptic Jewish literature that later became known as Christian apocalyptic theology. Several translations have been interpreted for the meaning of the phrase, and here is wisdom. Let him that have understanding count the number of the beast, where the peculiar Greek of the word siphisato is used. Possible translation to include to count, to reckon, to vote, to decide. The Textus Receptus, which is derived from the Byzantine text type, includes the number 666 as represented in the Greek numerical. However, as we're going to take a look at, it really has nothing to do with Greek, but rather a translation into the Greek from the Hebrew. And it says in verse 17 that no man might buy or sell save he that had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is the wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is a number of a man, and his number is 666. This is why we see the correlation between the beast that arise, which is a monster government made of different powers and entity, and it's given an identification as a human. Here we have now the beginning of the concept of Armellus, that no man might buy or sell save he that have the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name, either one of the three. Here is the wisdom. Let him that has understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. Now, as we look further into what this 666 means, it was utilized primarily as a Hebrew gematria in order to indicate who was the anti-Messiah or the man of iniquity or the evil empire, as it were, of the time when the Jews were trying to flee from such edict. Now, in the 2nd century, Irenaeus wrote that the number 666 reported to be several scribal errors, and theologians have doubted about that traditional reading because the appearance of the figure 616 is found in the Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, and also one of the great Uncial codices, as well as the Latin in the version of Tychonius. Now, in the ancient American version, you'll see that Irenaeus knew about this 616 reading, but did not adopt it according to the heresy in verse 30. In 380, the correcting that the existing language version of the New Testament, commonly referred as to the Virtus Latina, which Jerome retained the 666. In other words, many of the theologians think that 616 was a scribal error. Around 2005, a fragment of Papyrus 115 was taken from the Uncreus site, which was discovered by the University of Oxford in the Hashmolean Museum. It gave the number as 616. This fragment is the oldest manuscript that dates about 1,700 years ago or more of the passage of Revelation chapter 13. And it is founded around 2017. Now, the Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, known before as Papyrus 115, finds the date to it as after it. So it has also 616, not 666 written in it. Papyrus 115 have led many scholars to regard 616 as the original number of the beast. According to the theologian Paul Lewis, the number 666 has been substituted by 616, either by anthology with 888, another Greek number referring to that of Jesus, or because of the triangular number that sums of the first 36 numbers. Now let's take a look at some of the interpretation of this 666. Number one, the beast's identity and the beast number are usually interpreted by applying one of these three methods. First of all, interesting enough, they use gematria. That is a Hebrew system in which takes the value of the letter and translate it to its equal name to check matches of scriptural number. Number two, the second way of interpreting it, is by treating the number of the beast as a duration of time. Third, linking the scriptural imagery and symbolism as the Messiah nemesis or anti-Messiah with characteristics of a world leader who opposes the religion of one God, not just Christianity. Interesting that the identification of gematria in the Greek is isosephi and in the Hebrew is gematria, where every letter has a corresponding numeric value. Some of these numbers give a numeric value to a word or name, and this uses how it's calculated. The name of the beast is used in the following below interpretation. Now, there are those who happen to believe in the preterism. Preterism is an idea of eschatology which interprets that all prophecy of the Bible as events which have already happened. It took place already. This school of thought interprets the book of Daniel, for example, as referring to events that happened during the 7th century before the Common Era until the 1st century of the Common Era, like, for example, the destruction of the temple, the ceasing of the offerings, all happened to already taken place. And thus they see this as something in the past having taken place. In the Hebrew alphabet, the word for 666 is Neron Caesar or Nero Caesar, which is interpreted numerically as representing the number 50, the number 200, the number 6, the number 50, the number 100, the number 60, the number 200, which added up to 666. Here we have a mechanism which Jews, in order to identify the evil person that were to arise in the temple of God, making himself pass on as if he was God in the flesh, is identified as Nero Caesar or the Caesars. If you look at Jewish history, Jews were battling against Rome and the Caesars. There was a 7-year peace agreement that was entered in by the Hasmonean priesthood with Rome, and that was broken right in the middle of the 7-year agreement, in which then the empire came against the Jews. Thus, we can look at this as having taken place in the past. And here comes the word, the mark of the beast. Revelation 13:16 was the most commonly used as the imprint on documents or coins, called also charagma, as it was well attested to have been an imperial seal of the Roman Empire used as an official document in the 1st and 2nd century. In the reign of Emperor Decius, which is around 249 and 251 of the Common Era, those who did not possess the certificate of sacrifice to Caesar could not pursue trade. Interesting, the correlation that if you didn't have the authorization of the passport, boom, you cannot be in business, you cannot be actively involved. A prohibition that conceivably goes back to Nero, reminding one of Revelation chapter 13, verse 17. Keep in mind, this is not a Goyish thought. This was all within Jewish thoughts of apocalyptic realization during the 1st century. The preterists argue that the Revelation was written before the destruction of the temple, with Nero exiling John to an island, very similar as we have with Shimon Bar Yochai having to go into a cave. This was a common thing for Jews being persecuted against Rome and running away to hide to save their neck. Here we have another perfect example of what I am mentioning. So preterists argue that Revelation was written before the destruction of the temple, with Nero exiling John to Patmos. Most scholars, however, argue it was written after Nero had committed suicide in the year 68 of the Common Era. Interesting enough, Domitian continued the reign of the Roman Empire till about 95 or 96 of the Common Era. Later on, other theologians came to interpret this as a future prophetic event, as who dwell on earth will worship him. Keep in mind, one of the first things that the Caesars did was, when they destroyed the temple, is to prop themselves up as the savior of humanity. And this is why we have such a correlation with the idea of 666 to the final and ultimate one world government that seeks to destroy the Jews and the world at large. It has also been referenced in numerical reference to Nero that it was a code to imply, not directly identified to the Emperor Domitian, whose style of rulership resembled that of Nero. So we have now another aspect of the idea of Nero Caesar, which means it refers to the way the system worked, the way the rulers developed themselves, which became, as it were, a beast. The popular Nero Redivius legend, stating that Nero would return to life, can also be noted after Nero's suicide in the year 68 of the Common Era. This was a widespread belief, especially in Eastern province, that he was not dead and somehow would return. This whole idea of death and returning, comeback, second coming, all of this plays a big feature in this idea of 666. An Aramaic scroll from the Wadi Murabaat, dated in the 2nd year of Emperor Nero, refers to him by name and title. Interesting. Here we find this in the Basar, page 65. In Hebrew, it's Neron Caesar, pronounced as Neron Caesar. In Latin, it is also Nero Caesar. Interesting, the Kaisers have its origin also, as we found in Germany. The expression from the Greek to the Hebrew as Neron Caesar or Nero Caesar, we find the Hebrew equivalent of 666 as Resh 200, Samek 60, Kaf 100, Nun 50, Vav 6, Resh 200, and Nun 50, giving us a total of 666. The number or value of the name of the beast, which accordingly was Nero Caesar. Now, in this preterist view, in other words, the idea that this already took place, the view that the mark of the beast is a stamped image of the emperor's head on every coin of the Roman Empire, the stamp on the head or hand or in the mind, all of which no one could buy or sell. Interesting enough, this was the exchange value. So everything that we find in the first century is now replicated in today's modern time to see the realization, according to the scroll of Zorababel, in the person of Armellus. It is far more probable that the mark symbolizes an all-embracing economic power of Rome, whose very coin bore the image of the emperor and conveyed the claims to divinity, including the sun rays and the rules of the portrait. It had become increasingly difficult for Christians in particular at that time to function in a world in which public life, including economic life, trade, or guild required participation in idolatry. My friends, we're having the same issue. Here we have the problem of today. The idealist perspective of the number of the beast rejects the gematria, envisioning not the number, not as a code to be broken, but the symbol. What is understood as idealists would contend that because there are so many different names that come to 666, and most systems require converting names to other language or adding titles when convenient, it is impossible to come to a true consensus. Now, given the numbers are used figuratively throughout the book of Revelations, idealists interpret the number figuratively. The common suggestion is that because the 7 is a number of completeness, it is associated with the divine, 6 is incomplete, and the 3 sixes are inherently incomplete to its total exponent. The number of the 3 suggests that the dragon and the beast are profoundly deficient. Now, this is only part 1 of this series that I'm going to do about 666. This is innately a Jewish concept, not a Goyish, a Christian one. The historians believe, even in the book of Revelation, articulates the full range of history of the early Christian movement and to the time of the second coming of the Messiah. The author alludes to Daniel chapter 2, verse 28, chapter 2, verse 45, and Daniel's vision of Daniel 2 uses the symbol, giving a sequence of future events in history from Babylonian Empire through the Medo-Persian period, from Greece and Roman, continuing to the end of current civilization. The apocalyptic volume builds on Daniel's approach, focusing on major points of the Christian history and across the whole purview of the Messiah, the second coming. And all of this we will look at in the future. And we're going to look at this in detail because we need to understand very clearly that 666 does not at all represent the devil, but rather an evil empire in the same guise as we saw with Hitler, Yemach Shmo, as we saw with many evil leaders that arose in the world in an attempt to bring the world into one form of government. No doubt we are seeing this coming and arising once again. There are many information that I would like to give to you at this time, but because I want to break this down in more than one video, we're going to take a look at some of the Kabbalistic or esoteric sources that supports this. Keep in mind, in early Christianity and early Kabbalah of that time, they were just one. They weren't separated like we have today. That they call them Gnosticism, Kabbalist. In fact, in that time, there was only one idea of esotericism, and that was Jewish form. And from there derived many different lines of heresy or minut that also the Talmud makes reference to, among which this was one of them. So if you come to say that 666 is not Jewish, then you're going to have to come to say that even Kabbalah is not Jewish either, because they all come from the same source and breeding ground. And it comes from a moment of time in history that the Jews were being persecuted and they were hiding, and they wanted to identify who was this beast, which was called Nero Caesar. And today we have that beast re-arising again from the very depth of the earth, as it were, and we call it the one world government. So be careful. 666 is a Jewish concept. It does derive from Jewish literature. Revelation or apocalypse, although it fell into Christian hands, it was originally brought forth from a Jewish follower of a man named Jesus, but it was Jewish, 100% Jewish. The concepts are esoteric Kabbalism of the first century. Although they had a different Messiah figure, it still worked the same way. In Kabbalah and Zohar and different Kabbalistic materials, you'll find this also present, even when they count. In Torah scroll codes, you'll find that as well present. So no matter how you look at it, there's no way of divorcing the 666 as the beast that arises with Torah, Judaism, and Torah sources. This is Rabbi Moshe Otero, and I hope this was a step one to clearing many misconceptions that we have regarding 666. There will be a continuation of this concept and this teaching on video. This is just part one. Shalom, shalom.